Deep in the Cascade Mountains, where cell towers don't reach and the nearest neighbor is 20 miles away, Marcus Chen stared at the charred remains of what locals called the Witch's Cabin. 3 months ago, he'd been Seattle's most decorated fire chief. Now he was just another broken man running from the flames that took everything: his wife, his daughter, his will to live. The October wind whistled through gaps in the blackened timber, carrying the perpetual scent of old smoke that seemed to follow him everywhere these days. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter and stepped across the threshold, his boots crunching on debris that had been accumulating for decades. The real estate agent had warned him about the condition, practically begging him to reconsider. Complete teardown, she'd insisted. Foundations probably shot too. But Marcus hadn't been looking for a sound investment. He'd been looking for a place to disappear. The cabin's main room stretched before him, its walls streaked with soot patterns that spoke of a fire far older than the one that had consumed his own life. Afternoon sunlight filtered through a hole in the roof, illuminating motes of ash that danced like tiny ghosts. Marcus had seen enough fire damage to know this blaze hadn't been recent, maybe 20, 30 years old. The way the char pattern spread suggested it had started small, probably contained before it could spread to the surrounding forest. He'd bought the property sight unseen, using what remained of his savings after the lawyers and the investigations and the endless, suffocating sympathy of his former colleagues. 23 acres of Douglas fir and western hemlock, accessible only by a winding dirt road that turned to mud whenever it rained. Perfect isolation for a man who'd failed at the one job that mattered most. Marcus ran his fingers along the nearest wall, feeling the rough texture of burned wood. That's when he noticed them. Faint lines carved beneath the char. He scraped away a layer of soot with his fingernail, revealing what looked like deliberate markings. Not the random gouges left by animals or weather, but precise, intentional cuts in the wood. Curious despite himself, Marcus retrieved a wire brush from his truck and began working at a small section of wall. The soot came away reluctantly, as if guarding its secrets. Underneath, intricate symbols emerged: numbers, arrows, what looked like topographical markings. The carvings covered nearly every inch of exposed wood, creating an elaborate pattern that seemed to map the surrounding terrain. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself consumed by the puzzle. He worked methodically, section by section, uncovering a network of symbols that grew more complex with each cleared patch. Some markings were clearly coordinates. He recognized latitude and longitude notations that corresponded to local landmarks. Others showed wind directions, elevation changes, even what appeared to be seasonal weather patterns. But it was the fire symbols that made his breath catch. Stylized flames carved next to specific coordinates, with radiating lines that suggested spread patterns and evacuation routes. This wasn't random folk art or the bored scratches of a hermit. This was a sophisticated mapping system, decades ahead of its time. Marcus pulled out his phone, forgetting for a moment that he was beyond cell range. He'd have to drive back to town to research the property's history, find out who had lived here before the fire. The level of detail in these carvings suggested someone with serious forestry knowledge, someone who understood fire behavior on an almost scientific level. As darkness began to creep through the trees, Marcus reluctantly packed up his brush and headed for his truck. He'd planned to camp in town tonight, maybe grab dinner at the diner where the waitress had been pointedly ignoring his wedding ring for the past week. But something about the cabin held him. The symbols seemed to pulse in the fading light, begging to reveal their full story. He grabbed his sleeping bag and a battery-powered lantern from the truck bed. The cabin might not have a roof or walls worth trusting, but it had 4 corners and a sense of purpose that his empty apartment in Seattle had never possessed. He could camp here tonight, continue working on the symbols by lamplight. As he settled against the least damaged wall, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months: curiosity. Not the hollow distraction he'd been using to fill his days, but genuine interest in solving a mystery. Whoever had created this elaborate system had been trying to communicate something important. The fire symbols weren't just decorative, they were warnings, predictions, a roadmap for understanding how wildfires moved through this specific terrain. For the first time since the night he'd watched his own house burn while trapped 3 blocks away by a water main break, Marcus Chen felt a flicker of the man he used to be, the man who solved problems and saved lives and believed that preparation could prevent tragedy. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the evergreens with a sound like whispered secrets waiting to be discovered. The rusty key turned with surprising ease, as if the cabin had been waiting for him. Marcus pushed open the warped wooden door, wincing as it groaned on ancient hinges. The smell hit him immediately, not the musty decay he'd expected, but something cleaner, almost clinical, pine oil and something else he couldn't quite place. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light, streaming through grimy windows, but the interior was far from abandoned. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. Rough-hewn furniture sat arranged with deliberate care, a wooden table scarred by years of use, 2 mismatched chairs, shelves lined with mason jars filled with unidentifiable contents. Someone had been here recently. Marcus dropped his duffel bag and explored the single room. Behind a faded curtain, he found a narrow bed with military-precise corners. The mattress sagged but appeared clean. A small kitchen area occupied the far corner, a hand pump over a metal basin, a wood-burning stove, shelves stocked with canned goods that looked decades old but somehow untouched by rust. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, a framed photograph caught his attention. 3 men in outdated forestry uniforms stood beside a massive pine tree, their faces weathered and serious. One looked familiar, though Marcus couldn't place where he might have seen him. He lifted the frame, noting how the glass had been recently cleaned. A leather-bound journal lay open on the table, its pages yellowed with age. Marcus approached cautiously, as if the book might bite. The handwriting was precise, methodical. July 15th, 1987. 3rd consecutive week, without rain. Moisture content in Sector 7 dropping below critical threshold. Wind patterns shifting northeast. Evacuation protocols may be necessary. Fire weather observations. Marcus flipped back several pages, finding similar entries dating back months. All in the same careful script, all noting wind patterns, humidity levels, fuel moisture, the kind of detailed records that could mean the difference between containing a wildfire and watching it consume everything in its path. But 1987 was over 3 decades ago. He turned more pages, fascination overriding his exhaustion. The observations spanned years, different hands contributing entries. Maps had been sketched in margins showing creek beds, ridge lines, natural fire breaks. Someone, multiple someones, had been studying this forest with the devotion of scientists. A loose page fell from the journal's back cover. Unlike the others, this one was recent, the ink still dark. Weather station reports pressure drop, dry lightning possible next 48 hours. Check sectors 12 to 15 for accumulation. Time running short. Marcus's pulse quickened. Someone was still making these observations, still monitoring conditions. But the nearest weather station was 40 miles away, and sector designations weren't used by any official forestry service he knew of. Outside, something metallic clanged in the wind. Marcus stepped onto the cabin's small porch, scanning the tree line. Behind the structure, partially hidden by overgrown brush, stood what looked like a radio antenna. No, several antennas, along with equipment he didn't recognize. Solar panels gleamed between the branches, obviously new installations. A narrow path led into the woods beyond the equipment. Against his better judgment, Marcus followed it. The trail was well maintained despite its hidden nature, switchbacking up a steep slope. After 20 minutes of climbing, he emerged onto a rocky outcrop that offered a panoramic view of the surrounding forest. The vista was breathtaking and terrifying. Thousands of acres of dense woodland stretched in every direction, punctuated by the silver threads of streams and the darker green of valley floors. But Marcus saw what others might miss, the telltale signs of extreme fire danger. Dead branches cluttered the forest floor. Undergrowth had grown thick and dry. Entire sections of trees showed the grey-brown of drought stress. This wasn't just a forest, it was a massive bomb waiting for a spark. A weather monitoring station occupied the center of the outcrop, its instruments humming quietly. Digital readouts showed temperature, humidity, wind speed, barometric pressure. All the data was being recorded, transmitted somewhere. But to whom? Marcus found another journal in a weatherproof box beside the station. This one contained maps of the entire region, marked with symbols he didn't understand. Red zones, green corridors, numbered sectors corresponding to the observations he'd read below. Someone had divided this wilderness into a grid system and was tracking conditions in each area with military precision. The final entry was dated yesterday. Conditions deteriorating faster than projected. Humidity down 12% from last week. Wind patterns favorable for rapid spread if ignition occurs. Evacuation routes remain clear through sectors 3, 7, and 11, but window closing. Must accelerate timeline. Timeline. Part. Thunder rumbled overhead, though the sky showed only scattered clouds. Dry lightning, the kind that started fires without bringing rain to put them out. Marcus checked the weather station's display. Barometric pressure was dropping fast. He thought of the populated areas beyond the forest boundaries. The small towns, the scattered homes, the campgrounds and hiking trails. If a major fire started here with conditions this extreme, it wouldn't just burn. It would explode across the landscape faster than anything could stop it. Thousands would die. And somewhere in this wilderness, someone was watching, waiting, and apparently trying to prevent exactly that catastrophe. The morning sun filtered through dust-caked windows, casting fractured beams across the cabin's interior. Marcus had barely slept, his mind churning over the strange collection of documents scattered across the makeshift table. Coffee grounds floated in lukewarm water from his camp stove as he studied the papers again, trying to make sense of what he'd discovered. The files weren't random. They formed a pattern. Each incident report detailed fires that had occurred across 3 counties over the past 15 years. What struck him wasn't just the meticulous documentation, but the annotations scrawled in the margins. Someone had been tracking these fires, analyzing them, predicting them. His phone buzzed against the wooden table. Unknown number. Marcus? It's Sarah Chen from the State Fire Marshal's office. We need to talk. Marcus set down his tin cup, fully alert. Sarah Chen was a legend in fire investigation circles, known for her ability to uncover arson when others saw accidents. They'd worked together years ago on a warehouse fire that had nearly taken out half of downtown Millbrook. About what? About the cabin you're staying in. And about Thomas Brennan. The name sent a chill through him. Thomas Brennan had been the fire chief before Marcus, a man whose reputation was built on an almost supernatural ability to anticipate where fires would strike next. He'd saved countless lives by positioning crews in seemingly random locations, always arriving at scenes faster than should have been possible. Then he'd vanished 3 years ago, leaving behind only questions and his resignation letter. How did you know where I was? The same way Brennan knew where the next fire would be. Meet me at Riley's Diner on Route 9 in an hour. Come alone and bring whatever you found in that cabin. The line went dead. Marcus stared at the phone, then at the papers spread before him. The top document was a detailed analysis of wind patterns, humidity levels, and fuel load calculations for an area he recognized, the Riverside Industrial Park, where a massive blaze had been contained just 2 weeks before he'd lost his family. Brennan's handwriting filled the margins. High probability event, 73% certainty, recommend preposition engine 12 and ladder 4. That's exactly where the department had been when the call came in. Marcus had assumed it was routine patrol positioning. He gathered the papers, his hands trembling slightly. If these predictions were accurate, if Brennan had somehow developed a system for forecasting fires, then everything Marcus thought he knew about firefighting was wrong. More importantly, if the system worked, it meant fires could be prevented instead of just fought. The drive to Riley's diner took him through the valley where he'd spent his entire career. Every burned foundation, every scorched tree line held memories. The Henderson farm where they'd lost 2 barns to lightning. The elementary school where a faulty electrical system had nearly trapped 60 children. The apartment complex where Mrs. Rodriguez had died because they'd arrived 4 minutes too late. 4 minutes. If they'd known to be positioned closer, if they'd had advance warning. Sarah Chen was waiting in a corner booth, her silver hair pulled back severely and her grey eyes sharp as flint. She looked older than when he'd last seen her, worn down by years of sifting through ash and debris for truth. "You look terrible," she said, as he slid into the booth. "Thanks. You look fantastic, too." She didn't smile. "Show me what you found." Marcus pulled out the folder, watching her expression change as she flipped through the documents. Her fingers paused on a weather map covered in Brennan's calculations. "Where did you find these?" "Hidden in the cabin's floorboards." "Sarah, what the hell was Brennan working on?" She closed the folder and leaned back. "Something that got him killed." The words hit Marcus like cold water. "Killed? I thought he resigned and disappeared." "That's what we wanted people to think. Thomas called me 3 days before he vanished, said he'd figured out how to predict major fire events with near-perfect accuracy, said someone was trying to stop him from sharing it." "Someone?" He wouldn't say who over the phone, just that the system worked too well, saved too many lives, prevented too much damage, said there were people who didn't want that. Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, heavier now with possibility. "The insurance companies." Sarah nodded grimly. "Among others. Think about it. If fires can be predicted and prevented, what happens to emergency response budgets, equipment sales, reconstruction contracts? We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry built on disaster response." The diner suddenly felt too small, too exposed. Marcus glanced around at the other patrons, a trucker reading a newspaper, an elderly couple sharing pie, a man in a business suit typing on his laptop. "Why me? Why did this end up in my hands?" "Because Thomas trusted you, and because you have nothing left to lose." The floorboards groaned under Marcus's weight as he knelt beside the trapdoor, his flashlight beam cutting through the musty darkness below. The wooden ladder descended into what appeared to be a root cellar, but something about the precise construction suggested it served a different purpose entirely. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the ladder's weathered rungs. The whiskey from the night before still clouded his judgment, but curiosity overrode his caution. Each step downward brought cooler air and the scent of aged wood mixed with something metallic. The cellar stretched farther than expected, carved directly into the hillside behind the cabin. His flashlight revealed shelves lined with mason jars containing what looked like soil samples, each meticulously labeled with dates spanning decades. But it was the far wall that made him freeze. Maps, dozens of them, covering every inch of available space. Not ordinary topographical surveys, but detailed fire prediction charts with colored zones, wind pattern overlays, and vegetation density markers. Red pins dotted locations across 3 counties, connected by string that formed an intricate web of relationships Marcus couldn't immediately decipher. He approached slowly, his beam dancing across the organized chaos. Each map bore notations in cramped handwriting, dates and times scrawled in margins alongside temperature readings and humidity levels. The earliest maps dated back 30 years, the most recent just 2 months old. "What the hell were you doing, old man?" Marcus whispered to the empty cellar. A thick ledger rested on a makeshift desk, fashioned from sawhorses and plywood. Marcus opened it carefully, pages crackling with age. The entries began in 1994, written in the same precise hand that marked the maps. June 15th, Observed unusual drying pattern in Sector 7. Ground moisture down 23% from seasonal average. Recommend evacuation of Riverside Campground within 48 hours. June 18th. Fire started 11:47 a.m. Sector 7 as predicted. Riverside evacuated yesterday, no casualties. Officials attribute evacuation order to routine maintenance. Let them think what they will. Marcus's pulse quickened as he flipped through pages of similar entries, prediction after prediction, each marked with locations he recognized from his 20-year career fighting fires across the region. The Millfield Shopping Center fire of 2003, the apartment complex near the university in 2010, the warehouse district blaze just last year. Every single one had been predicted in this ledger, some weeks in advance. He thought of the evacuation orders that had seemed to come from nowhere, always attributed to gas leaks or electrical problems or mysterious tips. Anonymous calls that saved lives while he and his crews battled flames that someone, somehow, had seen coming. The final entry stopped him cold. March 3rd. Critical convergence developing Sector 12. All indicators suggest catastrophic event within 72 hours. Evacuation imperative for Maple Street residential area, particularly 400 block. Weather service shows no concern. They never do. God help those people. March 6th. The date burned in Marcus's memory like a brand, the night his world ended. His house sat at 412 Maple Street. The ledger slipped from his numb fingers, hitting the dirt floor with a muffled thud. Someone had known. Someone had predicted the fire that killed Sarah and Emma, and they'd tried to warn. Who? The authorities? Him? Marcus scrambled through loose papers scattered across the desk, searching for more recent entries. Any clue about what happened to the warning? He found radio logs documenting repeated attempts to contact the fire department's emergency line on March 4th and 5th. The caller was listed as anonymous, possible crank. Standard protocol had relegated the calls to low priority. He remembered those calls now. 3 of them, filed by different dispatchers who dismissed them as the work of someone mentally unstable. The caller had insisted on speaking directly to the fire chief, claimed to have critical information about an imminent fire emergency on Maple Street. Marcus had been in budget meetings those days, preparing for the quarterly review with City Council. He'd never taken the calls. The implications crashed over him like a physical blow. His family might have lived if he'd answered his phone, if he'd taken 3 minutes to listen to a stranger's warning instead of focusing on spreadsheets and municipal politics. But who was this person? How had they known with such deadly accuracy? Marcus played his flashlight across the maps again, noting the sophistication of the weather tracking equipment sketched in the margins. Barometric pressure readings, soil moisture content, wind speed measurements taken at precise intervals. This wasn't the work of some backwoods hermit with a weather radio. This was scientific methodology applied with obsessive dedication over decades. A new thought chilled him. If the predictions had been this accurate for 30 years, if this mysterious guardian angel had been saving lives all this time, why had the warnings stopped? The last entry was dated 2 weeks before the Maple Street fire. What happened to the person who'd created this underground oracle? More importantly, with fire season approaching and drought conditions already setting in, who was watching the patterns now? The basement door creaked open to reveal a narrow wooden staircase disappearing into darkness. Marcus hesitated at the threshold, his flashlight beam cutting through the musty air below. The smell hit him first, old paper, metal, and something else he couldn't identify. Something that made his firefighter instincts prickle with unease. Each step groaned under his weight as he descended. The basement was larger than he'd expected, stretching beyond the cabin's footprint. His light swept across the walls, revealing shelves lined with mason jars filled with unidentifiable substances, their contents gleaming dully in the beam. But it was the far wall that made him stop breathing. Maps. Dozens of them, covering every inch of available space. topographical surveys, Forest Service charts, weather pattern diagrams, all marked with red ink in what appeared to be different handwriting. Some markings were faded with age, others looked recent. Fire symbols dotted the landscape like a constellation of disasters, both past and predicted. Marcus moved closer, his pulse quickening. The maps weren't random. They told a story. Fire patterns spanning decades traced with meticulous detail, temperature readings, wind directions, humidity levels, all annotated in cramped handwriting along the margins. His eyes fixed on one map, showing the Riverside district where his family had died. A red circle marked their neighborhood, dated 3 months before the fire. "What the hell?" he whispered, touching the marking with trembling fingers. A thick ledger sat open on a makeshift desk constructed from sawhorses and plywood. Marcus flipped through pages of observations, calculations, and what looked like correspondence. The handwriting changed throughout. At least 3 different people had contributed to this collection over the years. One entry, dated just 2 weeks ago, made his blood run cold. Weather conditions optimal. Humidity dropping faster than predicted. Wind patterns shifting northeast. Evacuation routes compromised. Estimated casualties, 200 to 300, if current trajectory holds. Below it, coordinates that meant nothing to him, but were marked with today's date. A cardboard box tucked beneath the desk contained photographs. Marcus dumped them onto the surface, spreading them with shaking hands. Aerial shots of forest fires, ground-level images of burned structures, and, his breath caught, surveillance photos of fire department response teams. He recognized several faces, including his own from the Riverside fire. Someone had been watching, documenting, predicting. Sound of an engine cut through his racing thoughts. Marcus killed his flashlight and crept to the small basement window, peering through grimy glass. Headlights swept across the trees as a pickup truck approached the cabin. He watched a figure emerge, tall, wearing what looked like Forest Service gear. Heavy footsteps crossed the floor above. Marcus grabbed the ledger and as many photos as he could stuff into his jacket, his heart hammering against his ribs. The basement had no other exit. He was trapped. "I know you're here," a man's voice called from upstairs. "Saw the tire tracks, fresh ones." Marcus pressed himself against the wall beside the staircase, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. The footsteps moved methodically through the cabin, checking rooms, opening doors, professional, thorough. "Found some interesting reading material, did you?" The voice was closer now, just above the basement entrance. "That's 40 years of work you're looking at. 3 generations of watching this forest, learning its patterns, trying to save lives while everyone else ignores the warnings." The footsteps began descending the stairs. Marcus could see work boots, then legs clad in Forest Service pants. He held his breath, weighing his options, fight or try to talk his way out. Marcus Chen, disgraced fire chief, lost his family in a fire he should have seen coming. The man reached the bottom of the stairs, turning to face Marcus's hiding spot. "Sound about right?" Marcus stepped into view, keeping his distance. The man was in his 50s, weathered face marked by years of sun exposure. Forest Service patch on his sleeve, but something about him seemed off, too intense, too knowing. "Who are you?" Marcus demanded. "Someone who's been waiting for you to find this place. Name's Ray Hutchins. And before you ask, yes, I'm the one who left those reports on your windshield." Ray gestured toward the maps. "My father started this collection. His father before him. We've been tracking fire patterns in this region since the 1980s, trying to predict where the next disaster will strike. Those coordinates in the ledger will be tomorrow's headline if we don't act fast. There's a fire starting right now, about 12 miles north of here. Within 6 hours it'll be unstoppable. By morning it'll reach the Pinewood housing development." Ray's eyes were grim. 3,000 people, Marcus, including 2 elementary schools. Marcus stared at him, the weight of the stolen documents heavy in his jacket. "Why should I believe you?" Ray pulled out his radio, adjusting the frequency. Static filled the air, then voices, Dispatch calls, coordinates being relayed, the controlled urgency of first responders mobilizing. Because it's already begun. The metal box felt heavier than it should have as Marcus carried it to the cabin's main room. His hands trembled slightly, not from the weight, but from anticipation mixed with dread. Whatever was inside had been important enough for someone to bury and map its location with meticulous care. He set the box on the rough wooden table and examined the lock more closely. It was old, but well maintained, the brass still gleaming despite years underground. The keyhole was small, designed for a skeleton key that was probably long lost. Marcus retrieved a screwdriver from his toolbox and worked at the hinges instead, his breathing shallow as metal scraped against metal. The first hinge gave way with a sharp crack, then the second. Marcus lifted the lid carefully, his heart hammering against his ribs. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a leather journal bound with twine. Beneath it, he found a collection of photographs, their edges yellowed but images still clear. Marcus lifted the journal first, untying the twine with reverent fingers. The leather was supple, well cared for, and when he opened it, the pages released the faint scent of smoke. The first entry was dated 15 years ago, written in careful script, end day 1. The patterns are becoming clear. What they're calling random fires across the county follow a deliberate sequence. Someone knows exactly what they're doing. Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. He flipped through several pages, his eyes catching fragments and chemical accelerants and unknown strategic locations of by their testing response times. And handwriting belonged to Fire Chief Robert Henley, Marcus's predecessor, the man who'd trained him, who died in a car accident just months after Marcus took over the department. The photographs made everything worse. Aerial shots of fire scenes, close-ups of burn patterns, images of evidence that Marcus had never seen in any official report. Someone had been systematically documenting a series of arsons, and that someone had been his mentor. Day 847. Confirmed, they're mapping our entire emergency response network. Every major fire in the past 2 years has occurred at precisely calculated intervals and locations. They know our equipment, our staffing, our response protocols. They're studying us like lab rats. Marcus's hands shook as he read. Henley had discovered something massive, a conspiracy that went far beyond random arson. The entries detailed patterns across multiple counties, involving dozens of fires that had claimed hundreds of lives. Day 1203. I know who's behind it now. The name will shock everyone, but the evidence is undeniable. They're not just setting fires, they're engineering a complete breakdown of emergency services across the entire region. When they strike for real, when they light everything up at once, we won't be able to save anyone. The journal entry that followed was different, written in hasty, frightened script. They know I know. Found surveillance equipment in my house, my office. Phone lines tapped. I'm taking everything here, to the place where it all started. If something happens to me, if this looks like an accident, know that it wasn't. The real fire is coming, and when it does, thousands will die unless someone stops them. Marcus flipped frantically through the remaining pages, but they were blank. The final entry was dated just 3 days before Henley's fatal car crash, the crash that everyone, including Marcus, had accepted as a tragic accident on a rainy night. Beneath the journal, Marcus found detailed maps of the entire county, marked with red dots indicating fire locations and blue lines showing response routes. Pattern after pattern emerged as he studied them. Fires strategically placed to stretch resources thin, to identify weaknesses in the emergency response grid. But it was the final photograph that made his blood turn to ice water. A group photo, taken at some official function, showing Henley shaking hands with several men in expensive suits. Marcus recognized 2 of them immediately, County Commissioner David Walsh and Fire District Administrator James Morrison. Both men had been instrumental in the budget cuts that had weakened Marcus's department over the past 5 years, written on the back in Henley's handwriting, and the enemy has been inside the whole time. Marcus staggered backward from the table, his mind reeling. The fire that killed his family, was it part of this? Had Sarah and Emma died because he'd unknowingly been playing into some larger plan, dancing to strings pulled by people he'd trusted? The cabin suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. If Henley had been killed for what he'd discovered, what would they do to Marcus? More importantly, what was this real fire that Henley had written about? When was it supposed to happen? Marcus gathered the photographs and journal, his hands moving with desperate efficiency. He needed to get this evidence somewhere safe, needed to figure out who he could trust. Because if Henley was right, if everything Marcus thought he knew about the past 5 years was a lie, then somewhere out there, a clock was ticking towards something catastrophic, and this time, Marcus refused to let anyone else burn. The morning light filtered through the cabin's grimy windows as Marcus spread the documents across the wooden table, his coffee growing cold beside stacks of yellowed papers. Sleep had eluded him entirely after discovering the hidden compartment, his mind racing with possibilities and questions that multiplied with each page he read. The correspondence painted a disturbing picture. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been documenting suspicious patterns in building fires across 3 counties, all structures that had passed safety inspections with flying colors just months before they burned. Her notes revealed a methodical investigation into what she called accelerated material degradation, building materials that somehow became exponentially more flammable over time. Marcus rubbed his tired eyes and reached for another letter, this one bearing the letterhead of Pinnacle Construction Materials. The corporate response to Dr. Vasquez's inquiries was politely dismissive, citing proprietary information and suggesting she direct her concerns to local fire departments. But in the margins, Elena had scrawled her own observations in sharp, angry strokes. PCM supplied materials to all affected buildings. Coincidence? Not likely. A chill ran down Marcus's spine as he recognized the name. Pinnacle Construction Materials had been the primary supplier for the Riverside Elementary renovation project, the same school where his family had died, the same school where he'd been unable to explain why the fire had spread so impossibly fast, consuming everything in its path despite meeting every safety code. He fumbled through the papers until he found what he was looking for, a detailed chemical analysis of fire-retardant materials. Elena's handwriting filled the margins with calculations and theories about how certain compounds might break down under specific environmental conditions, actually becoming accelerants rather than suppressants. The science was beyond Marcus's expertise, but the implications were clear enough to make his hands shake. The sound of a vehicle approaching made him freeze. Through the window he watched a black SUV navigate the rough forest road, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Marcus quickly gathered the most important documents, stuffing them into his jacket as the vehicle came to a stop outside. 2 men in dark suits emerged, their movements precise and professional. The driver remained behind the wheel, engine running. Marcus recognized the type, corporate security, the kind companies like Pinnacle used when regular lawyers weren't enough. A firm knock echoed through the cabin. "Mr. Chen, we'd like to have a word." Marcus remained silent, his mind racing through options. The cabin's back door led into dense forest, but these men would have anticipated that. Instead, he moved to the front door and opened it just wide enough to see them clearly. "I'm sorry. You have me confused with someone else," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. The taller man smiled without warmth. Former Fire Chief Marcus Chen, terminated following the Riverside Elementary incident. "You've been asking questions about Dr. Elena Vasquez. I don't know what you're talking about." "The doctor was a troubled woman," the second man interjected, consulting a small notebook. "History of mental illness, prone to conspiracy theories. Her death was ruled accidental, carbon monoxide poisoning in her own home. Tragic, really." The casual mention of Elena's death hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he forced himself to show no reaction. "I'm sorry for your loss, but I still don't know who you're talking about." "Course not." The tall man's smile widened. Just as you probably don't know anything about certain documents that might have been left in this cabin. Documents that could be misinterpreted by someone without proper scientific training. Marcus felt the papers crinkle against his chest. This is private property. Actually, it's scheduled for demolition next week. Forest Service cleanup project. Amazing how quickly these old places can catch fire, especially with all the dry timber around. The man gestured casually at the surrounding trees. Electrical problems maybe, or an old propane tank. These accidents happen so fast, sometimes there's barely time to escape. The threat was delivered with the same pleasant tone one might use to discuss the weather. Marcus understood that he was being given a choice: walk away now and forget what he'd found, or join Elena Vasquez in her accidental death. I think there's been a misunderstanding, Marcus said finally. I'm just here for some peace and quiet, not interested in anyone else's business. Smart man. The tall man stepped back. Enjoy your peace and quiet, Mr. Chen, but maybe consider finding it somewhere else. This particular spot is about to become very unhealthy. Marcus watched them drive away before allowing himself to breathe normally again. His hands were shaking as he pulled out the documents, scanning them once more. Elena Vasquez had died for this information, and now he understood why. The scope of what she'd uncovered went far beyond a few suspicious fires. It suggested a systematic cover-up that had cost dozens of lives, including his own family. He had a choice to make, and this time he wouldn't run from the fire. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's grimy windows as Marcus spread the journal pages across the wooden table, weighing down the corners with coffee mugs and a rusted lantern. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged them in chronological order, the brittle paper crackling with each movement. Sleep had eluded him completely after discovering the hidden compartment, his mind racing with possibilities and dread. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell's handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, transforming from neat scientific notation to desperate scrawls. Marcus traced his finger along the lines, deciphering her coded observations about soil composition, underground mineral deposits, and something she referred to only as the network. The mycelial threads extend deeper than initially calculated. Root system penetration confirms connection to aquifer. If my calculations are correct, the contamination radius could reach the Anderson Creek watershed within 18 months. Marcus felt ice forming in his stomach. Anderson Creek supplied water to 3 counties, including his old jurisdiction. He fumbled for his phone, then remembered the dead battery. The solar charger he'd found wouldn't be enough. He needed to reach someone, but who would believe him? The next entry made his blood run cold. Day 52, company representatives visited again today, offered substantial compensation for my silence. When I refused, Mitchell became threatening. They know what they've done. They know about the network, about the timeline. They're counting on the remoteness of this location to buy them time. Marcus flipped frantically through the remaining pages. Dr. Hartwell had discovered something buried beneath the forest floor, some kind of industrial waste that was spreading through an underground fungal network, contaminating everything in its path. The fire that destroyed his family's neighborhood had been just the beginning. Day 58. Samples confirm my worst fears. The chemical composition matches the accelerant found at the Miller Street incident. They're not just covering up environmental damage, they're actively creating conditions for catastrophic fires. The insurance payouts must be worth more than the cleanup costs. The journal entry was dated 3 months before the fire that killed Sarah and Emma. Marcus shot to his feet, the chair clattering backward. His chest tightened as memories crashed over him. The unusual intensity of the blaze, the way it had spread so quickly through supposedly fire-resistant materials, the insurance investigators' puzzled expression when the chemical analysis came back with unexplained compounds. He'd been so consumed with guilt, so convinced of his own failure, that he'd never questioned the official report. But Dr. Hartwell had known. She'd tried to warn someone, and they'd silenced her. The final entries were barely legible, written in obvious haste. Day 63, they found my research station. Equipment destroyed, samples taken, moving everything to the cabin. If something happens to me, follow the markers. The evidence is buried with the source. Stop them before Miller Street becomes Riverside Avenue becomes... The entry ended mid-sentence, ink trailing off as if the pen had been dropped suddenly. Marcus gathered the papers with shaking hands, his firefighter's instincts finally overriding his grief-clouded judgment. 3 years of self-blame began crumbling as a different truth emerged. He hadn't failed his family. He'd been fighting a fire designed to be unstoppable. Outside, wind rustled through the trees with an ominous whisper. Marcus checked the remaining journal pages and found rough sketches of the surrounding area, marked with symbols he didn't recognize. Dr. Hartwell had hidden something in these woods, something worth killing for. A distant rumble made him freeze. Vehicle engines growing closer. Marcus stuffed the journal pages into his jacket and moved to the window. Through the trees, he caught glimpses of black SUVs winding up the old logging road. His pulse hammered as he counted 3 vehicles moving slowly but deliberately toward the cabin. They'd found him. He grabbed his backpack and the lantern, scanning the cabin for other exits. The back door was swollen shut from years of moisture, but desperation gave him strength. Wood splintered as he shouldered it open, stepping into the overgrown wilderness behind the cabin. The engine sounds were closer now, maybe 5 minutes away. Marcus oriented himself using Dr. Hartwell's sketches, looking for the markers she'd mentioned. There, a cairn of stones barely visible through the underbrush, arranged in an unnatural pattern. He plunged into the forest as the first SUV's engine cut off behind him. Voices carried through the trees, professional and urgent. These weren't local authorities. They moved too quietly, communicated too efficiently. Branches tore at his clothing as he followed the stone markers deeper into the woods. Each cairn led to the next, creating a trail that spiraled gradually downward toward what his map sense told him was a natural depression in the landscape. Behind him, the voices grew more distant but no less threatening. They were searching systematically, and they knew these woods. Marcus realized with growing certainty that Dr. Hartwell's disappearance hadn't been the first time they'd used this remote location to bury their secrets. The 4th marker stood beside a massive oak tree, its trunk scarred by some long-ago lightning strike. Dr. Hartwell had carved an arrow into the bark, pointing toward a barely visible path that led down into a ravine shrouded in morning mist. Marcus took a deep breath and followed it into the shadows, carrying with him the weight of truth and the terrible knowledge that his real fight was just beginning. Marcus's hands shook as he spread the documents across the cabin's dusty table, the weight of Henderson's revelation pressing down on him like smoke filling a burning room. The fire chief's words echoed in his mind, and coordinated, planned. Your family wasn't the first. The manila folder contained photographs, incident reports, and newspaper clippings dating back 15 years. Each fire bore the same signature, accelerant patterns that investigators had dismissed as coincidental, witness statements describing similar suspicious vehicles, and most damning of all, a connection Marcus hadn't seen before. Every victim had been involved in environmental activism or land preservation efforts. His wife Sarah's face smiled back at him from a newspaper clipping about the Wetlands Preservation Committee. She'd fought so hard to protect that marshland from development, working late into the night on proposals and attending countless council meetings. Marcus had teased her about her passion, calling her his environmental warrior. Now that dedication felt like a target painted on their family's back. The cabin's generator hummed in the background as Marcus cross-referenced dates and locations. The pattern was methodical, almost surgical. A fire here, an accident there, each one removing a key voice from environmental causes across 3 counties. The perpetrators had been patient, spacing incidents months apart, using different methods to avoid detection. A sound outside made Marcus freeze. Footsteps on gravel, deliberate and approaching. He quickly gathered the documents, his training kicking in despite the isolation he'd wrapped himself in for months. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and Henderson wasn't due back until morning. Through the grimy window, Marcus glimpsed a black sedan parked where the overgrown driveway met the main road. Two figures moved through the trees, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. His pulse quickened as he recognized the tactical precision of their approach. These weren't lost hikers. Marcus grabbed Henderson's radio and the folder, then slipped out the cabin's back door into the forest he'd come to know intimately. The dense canopy overhead blocked most of the moonlight, but months of solitary walks had mapped every root and fallen log. He moved with the same careful urgency he'd once used navigating smoke-filled buildings, except now he was the one being hunted. The radio crackled softly. Henderson's voice came through in a whisper. "Marcus, if you're hearing this, they know. My office was broken into an hour after I left you. Get to the old fire tower on Beacon Ridge. Trust no one else." Behind him, Marcus heard the cabin door splinter open. Shouts echoed through the trees as his pursuers discovered his escape. He killed the radio's volume and pushed deeper into the forest. The documents clutched against his chest like a lifeline. The terrain grew steeper as he climbed toward Beacon Ridge. His legs, weakened by months of grief and alcohol, burned with each step. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the fire of purpose now blazing in his chest. For the first time since the night he'd lost everything, Marcus felt truly alive. 20 minutes later, he reached the abandoned fire tower, a 60-foot steel structure that had been decommissioned years ago when satellite monitoring replaced human spotters. Henderson was already there, his face grim in the pale light of his phone. "They move faster than I expected," Henderson said, as Marcus climbed the ladder to the tower's observation deck. "Someone with serious resources is behind this. My investigation files are gone, but I had copies hidden elsewhere." "Who are we dealing with?" Marcus asked, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Henderson pulled out a tablet, its screen showing aerial photos of the wetlands Sarah had fought to protect. Meridian Development Corporation. They've been quietly acquiring land across the region, but environmental groups kept blocking their permits. Every fire victim had opposed one of their projects. The pieces clicked together in Marcus's mind with devastating clarity. The marshland Sarah died protecting was now a shopping complex. The forest preserve that cost another activist his life had become a luxury subdivision. Each tragedy had been transformed into profit. "They killed my family over a real estate deal," Marcus said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Worse," Henderson replied. "Look at this." He swiped to a new image showing Meridian's planned development for the entire forest surrounding Marcus's retreat. "They're not done. This whole area is scheduled for clearing next month. 500 families live in the valley below. If they use the same methods..." Below them, flashlight beams swept through the trees, growing closer. Henderson's radio buzzed with intercepted communications. Their pursuers had called for backup. "We have evidence," Marcus said, gripping the folder tighter. "Evidence isn't enough," Henderson replied. "They own judges, inspectors, half the county council. We need to stop them ourselves." The metal box felt heavier than it should have as Marcus carried it back to the cabin. His hands trembled, not from the weight, but from the implications of what he'd discovered. Inside were documents that could change everything, evidence of a conspiracy that stretched back decades and reached into the highest levels of the fire department he'd once served with pride. He set the box on the rough wooden table and lit the oil lamp, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The first document he pulled out was a handwritten letter dated 15 years ago, signed by Chief Harold Morrison, Marcus's predecessor and mentor, the man who had recruited him, shaped his career, and whose death had paved the way for Marcus's promotion to chief. The letter was addressed to someone identified only as TR and contained detailed information about planned building inspections, fire code violations that would be overlooked, and specific dates when certain warehouses would be accidentally understaffed. Marcus read it twice before the full horror sank in. Morrison hadn't been the honorable man Marcus had believed him to be. He'd been part of something much darker. The next document made Marcus's blood run cold. It was a list of fires, dates, and casualty counts spanning 25 years, Some he recognized immediately: the Riverside Elementary fire that had killed 6 children, the Paradise nursing home blaze that claimed 18 elderly residents, the downtown apartment complex that had taken 12 lives, all ruled accidental. All, according to these documents, deliberately orchestrated. At the bottom of the list, in red ink, was an entry that made his vision blur: Hillcrest Residential, March 15th. Target: Fire Chief Marcus Reed. Collateral: wife, daughter. Status: complete. The paper slipped from his numb fingers and fluttered to the floor. They hadn't just killed his family, they had specifically targeted him. Sarah and Emma had died because someone wanted to destroy him, to remove him from his position. But why? With shaking hands, he reached for the next document. It was a memorandum outlining something called Operation Clearfield, a systematic plan to eliminate certain buildings and neighborhoods to make way for development projects. The fires weren't random acts of arson for insurance money. They were part of a massive urban renewal scheme that would generate billions in profits for a select group of investors. Marcus found a map of the city with locations marked in different colors. Red dots indicated fires that had already occurred. Yellow dots showed planned targets. There were hundreds of yellow dots scattered across the map, concentrated in low-income neighborhoods and areas slated for gentrification. The scope was staggering. They were planning to burn down half the city, one carefully orchestrated accident at a time. He discovered financial records showing payments to fire inspectors, building contractors, and city officials, bribes disguised as consulting fees, renovation contracts awarded to shell companies, and insurance payouts funneled through offshore accounts. The network of corruption reached into the mayor's office, the planning commission, and even the police department. But it was the final document that stopped his heart completely. A personnel file with his own photograph clipped to the front. Inside was a psychological evaluation he'd never authorized, detailing his obsessive commitment to fire safety protocols and his unwillingness to compromise on regulatory enforcement. There were surveillance reports documenting his daily routines, his family's schedules, and detailed assessments of his potential threat to the operation. The file contained transcripts of conversations he'd had with Sarah about suspicious fire patterns he'd been investigating, phone calls he thought were private, recorded and analyzed. They'd been watching him for months before they acted, studying him like a laboratory specimen. A loose photograph fell from the file, a surveillance shot of Sarah picking Emma up from school, taken just days before the fire. On the back, someone had written in neat handwriting, "Leverage identified. Proceed with Plan B if direct approach fails." Marcus stumbled outside and vomited into the bushes, his body rejecting the poison of what he'd learned. When the retching stopped, he leaned against a tree and tried to process the magnitude of the conspiracy. These people hadn't just destroyed his life. They'd been systematically murdering innocent people for decades, and they were planning to do it again on an unprecedented scale. He thought about the old caretaker's final words: "You're the only one who can stop them now." The man had died protecting these documents, knowing that Marcus would eventually find them, knowing that he might be the only person in a position to expose the truth. Walking back into the cabin, Marcus spread the documents across the table and began photographing each one with his phone. He had evidence now, proof of crimes that would send dozens of powerful people to prison for life. But he also knew that these people had killed to protect their secret, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill again. As he worked, a plan began forming in his mind. He couldn't go to the police. Too many of them were compromised. He couldn't trust the fire department or city officials, but there was another way, a path that would require him to become something he'd never been before. Tomorrow, he would stop being a victim and start being a hunter. The manila folder felt heavier than it should have as Marcus spread its contents across the cabin's weathered table. 23 photographs stared back at him, buildings reduced to ash, families torn apart, lives extinguished in flames that should never have spread so fast or burned so hot. Each image bore the same telltale signs he'd observed in his own tragedy: accelerated burn patterns, structural failures that defied conventional fire behavior, and residue traces that matched the compound he'd discovered in the mountain laboratory. Sarah leaned over his shoulder, her breath catching as she recognized several locations. The Riverside Elementary fire, that was supposed to be electrical, and the Morrison apartment complex. They blamed faulty wiring in the basement. All lies. Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. He pulled out a magnifying glass he'd found among Dr. Chen's belongings and examined the residue samples more closely. The crystalline structure was identical in every case. Someone's been using Chen's formula as a weapon for at least 5 years. The radio crackled to life, startling them both. Unit 7 to base. We've got eyes on the target location. Cabin appears occupied. Smoke from the chimney, fresh tire tracks. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. They found us. Marcus swept the photographs into the folder and shoved it into his jacket. His mind raced through their options. The cabin had only one road leading to it, but the forest offered dozens of hiking trails that wound through the mountains. The problem was the evidence. If Hendricks and his people destroyed it, the truth would die with them. "The back window," he whispered, moving toward the rear of the cabin. "There's a deer path that leads down to Miller's Creek. We can follow it to the old logging road. What about the files? Chen's research?" The sound of engines grew closer, multiple vehicles navigating the winding mountain road. Marcus made his decision. He grabbed the laptop and shoved it into a waterproof bag he'd noticed earlier, then headed for the loose floorboard where he'd hidden his service weapon. The metal felt foreign in his hands after months of isolation, but muscle memory kicked in as he checked the magazine. "Can you shoot?" he asked Sarah. She shook her head. "I work in an office, Marcus. The most dangerous thing I handle is a paper shredder." "Then stay behind me and do exactly what I say." They slipped out through the back window just as the first black SUV rounded the bend in the road. Marcus counted at least 3 vehicles, which meant they were outnumbered 6-1, minimum. The men emerging from the cars moved with military precision. This wasn't Hendricks' first cleanup operation. The deer path was steep and treacherous, made worse by the late afternoon shadows that turned every root and rock into a potential ankle breaker. Behind them, voices carried through the thin mountain air. "Cabin's empty, but it's been occupied recently. Coffee's still warm. Fan out. Check the perimeter." They can't have gotten far. Marcus pulled Sarah down behind a fallen log as flashlight beams swept through the trees above them. The forest was their ally now. He knew these mountains from countless search and rescue operations during his years as fire chief. But their pursuers had advantages too: numbers, equipment, and the kind of resources that came with government backing. A twig snapped somewhere to their left. Marcus raised his weapon, finger resting lightly on the trigger. Through the undergrowth, he caught a glimpse of tactical gear and recognized the man wearing it. Agent Morrison, Hendricks' second-in-command. The same agent who had questioned him about the warehouse fire, who had seemed just a little too interested in what evidence Marcus might have recovered. Morrison was moving methodically down the slope, following their trail with practiced ease. In another minute, he'd spot their hiding place. Marcus weighed his options: take the shot and reveal their position to the other searchers, or try to wait it out and hope Morrison missed their tracks in the fading light. The decision was made for him when Sarah's elbow knocked against the waterproof bag, producing a soft rustle that might as well have been a gunshot in the forest silence. Morrison's head snapped toward their location, and his weapon came up fast. Marcus fired first, the muzzle flash illuminating Morrison's surprised face for a split second before the agent tumbled backward into the brush. Shouts erupted from multiple directions as the other searchers converged on the gunshot's echo. "Run," Marcus breathed, and they plunged deeper into the darkening forest, carrying with them the only proof that could expose a conspiracy built on ash and blood. The radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., jolting Marcus from his restless sleep on the cabin floor. Sarah's voice cut through the static, urgent and breathless. "Marcus, are you there? We've got a situation." He scrambled for the device, his heart already racing. "I'm here. What's happening?" 3 separate fires just ignited simultaneously across the county. Industrial district, residential complex near Pine Ridge, and the old Hartwell lumber yard. Same signature as the others, accelerant patterns, entry points. But Marcus, they're bigger this time. Much bigger. Marcus was already pulling on his boots, his mind racing. The arsonist had escalated, just as he'd feared. The calculated progression from the journal notes was reaching its crescendo. Casualties? Unknown. Emergency crews are spread thin. The residential fire, Sarah's voice caught. There's a daycare center in that complex. Night shift workers' kids. The words hit him like a physical blow. Images of Emma and Tyler flashed through his mind, their faces in the smoke, their voices calling for him. His hands shook as he grabbed the journal and stuffed it into his jacket. "Marcus, you can't. Your suspension—" To hell with the suspension. He was already moving toward his truck. "Text me the addresses." The drive into town blurred past in a haze of adrenaline and dread. The orange glow on the horizon grew brighter with each mile, and by the time he reached the outskirts, the acrid smell of smoke filled the cab of his truck, despite the closed windows. He headed for the residential complex first. Children were in danger, and nothing else mattered. The scene was chaos. Fire trucks surrounded the 3-story building, their lights painting the night in strobing reds and blues. Flames consumed the upper floors, while crews battled to contain the spread. Marcus parked at the perimeter and spotted Chief Reynolds barking orders near the command truck. "Reynolds!" Marcus approached, expecting to be turned away. The chief spun around, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "Marcus, what the hell are you doing here?" "The daycare." "How many kids?" Reynolds' expression shifted from anger to grim acceptance. 7 confirmed inside. Night staff of 2 adults. "We can't get through the main stairwell. It's completely engulfed. Back stairs are compromised." Marcus studied the building, his trained eye cataloguing exit points and structural weaknesses. The fire pattern was wrong, too uniform, too perfectly distributed to block escape routes. This wasn't just arson, it was engineered to trap victims. "3rd floor window, east side," Marcus said, pointing. "There's a service ladder that runs up the back wall, hidden by the dumpster enclosure." Reynolds followed his gaze, squinting through the smoke. "I don't see any ladder." "It's there. Building codes from 1987, they were required but often camouflaged. I remember the original plans." Marcus was already moving toward the building. "Get your team to that window." "Marcus, you can't." But he was already running, pulling his jacket up over his mouth and nose. The heat intensified as he reached the back of the building, and sure enough, the service ladder was there, painted to match the building and nearly invisible in the smoke. He climbed fast, his muscles burning from the effort and the toxic air. At the 3rd floor he could hear them, children crying, adults calling for help. The window was reinforced glass, probably locked from the inside. Marcus used his elbow to smash through, clearing the jagged edges with his jacket. Smoke poured out as he climbed inside, immediately dropping to a crouch where the air was clearer. "Fire department," he called. "Where are you?" A woman's voice answered from the far corner. "Here, we're here." He followed the sound, crawling through the smoke-filled room until he found them. 2 adults and 7 children, ranging from toddlers to maybe 8 years old, huddled in what looked like a bathroom with towels stuffed under the door. "We're getting you out," Marcus said, lifting the smallest child, one at a time through the window. "There are firefighters waiting." The evacuation took precious minutes. Each trip to the window and back felt like an eternity, the heat growing more intense, the smoke thicker. On his final trip, carrying twin boys who couldn't have been older than Tyler, Marcus felt the floor buckle beneath his feet. He dove for the window as the ceiling behind them collapsed in a shower of sparks and debris. Strong hands pulled him and the children through to safety on the ladder platform where Reynolds himself was waiting. As they descended, Marcus caught sight of the crowd below. Paramedics rushed forward to treat the children. their parents arriving in various states of panic and relief. But what stopped Marcus cold was a figure at the edge of the parking lot, partially hidden by an ambulance. A man in a dark coat, watching the scene with obvious satisfaction. Even through the smoke and chaos, Marcus could see the self-satisfied smile, the calculating way he observed the rescue efforts. Their eyes met across the distance, and the man's smile widened before he turned and disappeared into the crowd. The arsonist had been watching, enjoying his work, and now he knew Marcus was back in the game. The morning air bit at Marcus's skin as he crouched beside the smouldering remains of what had once been the Riverside Industrial Complex. 3 buildings reduced to skeletal frames and ash, just as his research had predicted. The acrid smell of melted plastic and charred metal filled his nostrils, a familiar cocktail that should have triggered his usual paralysis. Instead, he felt only a cold determination. Detective Sarah Chen approached from behind the fire trucks, her notebook already in hand. "Thought I might find you here," she said, her breath visible in the crisp air. "This makes 4 in 2 weeks." Marcus stood, brushing soot from his hands. "4 that we know of. There could be more we haven't connected yet." He gestured toward the ruins. Same pattern. Electrical system overload in the southwest corner, rapid spread through the ventilation system. Whoever's doing this knows exactly how these buildings are designed to fail. The media's calling it the most sophisticated arson spree in state history, Chen said, flipping through her notes. But we still don't have a single witness, no clear motive, and the accelerant residue is so minimal our lab techs are questioning whether it's arson at all. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling to the photographs he'd taken of the cabin's hidden room. The wall covered in building schematics, the detailed notes about fire suppression failures, the timeline that stretched back 15 years. That's because they're not looking for traditional arson markers. This isn't about destroying property for insurance money or revenge. It's about proving a point. The cabin where I've been staying, it belonged to someone who's been planning this for years, maybe decades. Look at these blueprints. Every building that's burned is represented here, along with dozens of others. Schools, hospitals, apartment complexes, all with the same structural vulnerabilities. Chen zoomed in on one of the images, her face paling. "That's Roosevelt Elementary. My daughter goes there." She looked up at Marcus. "You're saying these aren't random targets?" "Nothing about this is random. Each fire is a demonstration, a proof of concept. The arsonist isn't just destroying buildings, they're exposing how easily they can be destroyed. And if my analysis is correct, they're building up to something much bigger." A shout from across the debris field interrupted them. Fire Marshal Rodriguez was waving them over to where a section of the building's foundation had been exposed. As they approached, Marcus could see what had caught Rodriguez's attention: a series of small, precisely drilled holes in the concrete, each filled with what looked like ordinary construction putty. "Found these about 10 minutes ago," Rodriguez explained, pointing to the holes. At first glance, they look like standard anchor points for equipment mounting. But the spacing is wrong, and this putty, he scraped away a small sample. It's not standard construction material. Marcus knelt beside the holes, his mind racing. The cabin's research had mentioned something about structural weak points, about how minimal interventions could cascade into catastrophic failures. "It's not meant to cause the fire," he said slowly. "It's meant to ensure the building collapses in a specific way once the fire starts." "Controlled demolition," Chen said, understanding dawning in her voice. "They're not just burning these places down, they're making sure they fall." Rodriguez's radio crackled to life. "All units, we have a structure fire at 1247 Oak Street. Multiple buildings involved, possible entrapment." The address hit Marcus like a physical blow. Oak Street was lined with the old converted warehouses that now served as artist lofts, the same type of building that had killed his family. The same type of building featured prominently in the cabin's research. "That's 8 blocks from here," Chen said, already moving toward her car. "If this is our guy's work, the timing isn't coincidental. He wanted us here when the next one started." Marcus ran alongside her, his mind cataloguing everything he'd learned from the hidden room. The careful documentation, the methodical approach, the focus on buildings where fire suppression systems would fail catastrophically. The lofts don't have proper fire separation between units. If this follows the same pattern, anyone inside will have less than 4 minutes to escape. They reached Chen's car as the first sirens began wailing in the distance. As she gunned the engine, Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. But this time, it felt different. This time, he knew what he was racing toward. The radio chatter filled the car as they sped through the empty morning streets. Multiple casualties reported. Structure showing signs of imminent collapse, requesting additional units. Each transmission drove home the same terrible truth. They were too late to prevent this fire, but maybe, just maybe, they could still save the people trapped inside. Marcus stared ahead at the growing column of black smoke, his hands clenched in determination. The cabin had shown him the scope of the threat, but now it was time to prove he could still make a difference. The photograph trembled in Marcus's weathered hands as recognition dawned like a cold sunrise. The face staring back at him from the decades-old image was unmistakable. Deputy Chief Harrison, 20 years younger, but with those same calculating eyes that had watched Marcus's world burn. In the photo, Harrison stood beside a group of men in suits, all smiling beneath a banner that read, Meridian Development Partnership. Sarah moved closer, her breath visible in the cabin's frigid air. "You know him." "My deputy chief." Marcus's voice came out as a croak. "The man who's been undermining every safety protocol I've tried to implement. The one who called me paranoid for pushing evacuation procedures." Elena's fingers danced across her laptop keyboard, the screen's glow casting harsh shadows on her face. Meridian Development went bankrupt in 2003, but not before they made millions cutting corners on fire safety systems across the Pacific Northwest. Look at this. Harrison wasn't just connected to them, he was their inside man at the fire department. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Marcus sank onto the cabin's makeshift bench, his mind reeling through years of blocked initiatives, dismissed warnings, and bureaucratic roadblocks that had seemed like typical government inefficiency, but now revealed themselves as deliberate sabotage. Sarah's hand found his shoulder. "Marcus!" A sharp crack outside silenced her. Marcus was on his feet instantly, muscle memory from decades of emergency response overriding his emotional turmoil. He moved to the window, peering through the grimy glass into the forest beyond. "Someone's out there," he breathed, watching shadows move between the trees. Multiple contacts, approaching from the east. Elena slammed her laptop shut, stuffing it into her bag alongside the documents they'd discovered. "How did they find us?" "Harrison's been tracking me since I left the city," Marcus realized. "He probably has contacts in every agency from the fire department to the forestry service. We played right into his hands by staying here." The sound of vehicles grew louder, at least 2 trucks navigating the narrow forest road that led to the cabin. Marcus's mind raced through their options. The cabin was defensible but isolated, with only one road in and out. They were trapped unless they went on foot into the wilderness. "There's a trail behind the cabin," he said, grabbing the emergency pack he'd assembled during his weeks of solitude. "It connects to an old logging road about 2 miles north. If we move fast—" The front window exploded inward as a rifle shot shattered the glass. Marcus tackled Sarah to the floor as Elena dove behind the overturned table that had served as their makeshift research station. "Marcus Chen!" Harrison's voice carried across the clearing, amplified by a bullhorn. "You've stumbled into something way over your head. Come out peacefully, and maybe we can work something out." "Like hell," Marcus muttered, crawling toward the back of the cabin where he'd spotted a loose floorboard during his first week here. His fingers found the hidden space beneath, retrieving the service pistol he'd stashed there, a habit from his military days that even civilian life hadn't broken. Sarah's eyes widened at the sight of the weapon. "You're not seriously thinking of fighting our way out?" I'm thinking of keeping us alive long enough to get this information to someone who can act on it. Marcus checked the pistol's magazine, muscle memory guiding his movements. Elena, how much of this can you upload remotely? I need a solid internet connection, she replied, her laptop already open again. Cell coverage here is spotty at best. Another shot splintered the cabin's front door. Through the broken window, Marcus could see muzzle flashes from at least 4 different positions. Harrison had brought serious firepower, more than what would be justified for retrieving one disgraced fire chief. This proves everything, Sarah said, her journalist instincts overriding her fear. They wouldn't risk this kind of exposure unless the stakes were enormous. Marcus thought about the documents Elena had uncovered, the pattern of compromised safety systems, the upcoming weather conditions that would create a perfect firestorm, the thousands of people living in the danger zone completely unaware of the threat. Harrison and his conspirators had spent decades setting up this catastrophe, and now they were willing to kill to protect their secret. The sound of footsteps on the cabin's front porch made the decision for him. Marcus rose from his crouch, Sarah and Elena flanking him as they moved toward the back exit. Whatever came next, they had to survive long enough to warn the world about what was coming. Behind them, the front door burst open with a crash that echoed through the forest like thunder. The abandoned mine shaft yawned before them like the mouth of some primordial beast, its entrance partially concealed by decades of overgrowth. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he swept his flashlight beam across the weathered wooden supports that framed the opening. The air that drifted up from the depths carried an unmistakable chemical tang, the same scent he detected in the cabin's hidden laboratory. "This has to be it," Sarah whispered, adjusting her equipment pack. The geological surveys from the 1940s show this mine connects to a network of natural caves that run directly beneath Millbrook. Marcus studied the makeshift pulley system that had been rigged near the entrance, its ropes still relatively new, despite the mine's apparent abandonment. Someone's been using this recently, very recently. They began their descent. The modern climbing gear Sarah had procured a stark contrast to the mine's ancient infrastructure. As they dropped deeper, the chemical smell grew stronger, and Marcus found himself fighting memories of that terrible night when he'd failed his family. The acrid smoke, the sensation of walls closing in, the helpless rage that had consumed him, it all came rushing back in the confined space. "Marcus!" Sarah's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. "Look at this." 20 feet down, a horizontal tunnel branched off from the main shaft. Unlike the rough-hewn walls above, this passage showed signs of recent excavation and reinforcement. Emergency lighting had been strung along the ceiling, though it wasn't currently active. They followed the tunnel for what felt like miles, the path gradually sloping downward. Marcus's fire chief instincts were screaming warnings about ventilation and structural integrity, but his need for answers drove him forward. The tunnel eventually opened into a vast underground chamber that took his breath away. The cavern had been transformed into a sophisticated laboratory that dwarfed the setup in the cabin above. Industrial-grade equipment lined the walls, chemical processors, storage tanks, and monitoring systems that hummed with barely contained energy. But it was the massive drilling apparatus in the center that made Marcus's blood run cold. "Jesus Christ," he breathed, moving toward the machine. "They're not just manufacturing accelerant down here. They're preparing to inject it directly into the groundwater system." Sarah was already photographing everything, her camera flash illuminating the scope of the operation. "Marcus, look at these storage tanks. There's enough chemical here to contaminate the water supply for the entire region. We're talking about thousands of people." A sound from the tunnel behind them froze them both, the mechanical whir of the pulley system engaging. Someone else was coming down. "Hide!" Marcus hissed, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her behind a bank of storage tanks. They crouched in the shadows as footsteps echoed through the chamber, accompanied by voices that grew clearer as the newcomers approached. "Told you the timeline has been moved up," a gravelly voice was saying. Marcus recognized it immediately, Chief Peterson, his former colleague and supposed friend. The City Council meets tomorrow to approve the new development contracts. Once those are signed, we trigger the contamination event, and you're certain the blame will fall on the old factory. This voice was unfamiliar, younger, nervous. The chemical signatures will match perfectly. We've made sure of that. The factory gets sued into oblivion, the land gets condemned and sold for pennies, and our investors make a killing when the new resort complex breaks ground. Peterson's laugh was cold, calculating. 30 years I've been fighting fires in this godforsaken town. Time I made some real money from other people's disasters. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, the same fury that had driven him to the cabin in the first place. But now it was focused, purposeful. This wasn't about his failure anymore. It was about preventing a catastrophe that would dwarf anything he'd experienced before. "What about Kane?" the younger voice asked. "He's been asking questions, getting too close." "Kane's a broken man drinking himself to death in the woods. Nobody listens to disgraced fire chiefs, especially ones who couldn't save their own families." The casual cruelty in Peterson's voice made Marcus's hands clench into fists. "Besides, if he becomes a real problem, well, these old mines can be dangerous places." Sarah's hand found Marcus's arm, holding him back as the men moved toward the drilling equipment. Her grip was the only thing keeping him from charging into the open and confronting Peterson directly. Instead, they waited, gathering evidence, documenting everything. When the men finally left, Marcus and Sarah remained hidden for another 20 minutes before emerging from their hiding spot. The full scope of the conspiracy was now clear, a coordinated effort to poison an entire community for financial gain, with his former friend at the center of it all. "We have to stop them," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger and determination. Marcus nodded, feeling something he hadn't experienced in months: purpose. The path to his redemption was finally clear. Marcus felt the weight of 27 years of firefighting experience pressing down on his shoulders as he stood before the massive steel door of the Meridian chemical plant. The keycard he'd found in Dr. Elizabeth Crane's abandoned research files had gotten him this far, past the outer security checkpoint, under cover of darkness. Now came the hard part. The facility loomed against the starless sky like a metallic cancer, its smokestacks belching pale vapor that caught the moonlight. Somewhere inside this industrial labyrinth lay the evidence that would expose the conspiracy, proof that Meridian had knowingly manufactured defective fire suppression systems that had killed his family and countless others. His radio crackled. "Marcus, you've got maybe 15 minutes before the next security sweep," came Sarah's voice from the surveillance van parked 2 miles away. She'd insisted on being his eyes and ears for this mission, despite his protests about keeping her safe. "Copy that." Marcus pressed the keycard to the reader and held his breath. A green light blinked, and the lock disengaged with a soft click. Dr. Crane's security clearance was still active, even 3 months after her suspicious death in a car accident. The corridor beyond was sterile and fluorescent bright, lined with warning signs about chemical hazards and authorized personnel only. Marcus moved quickly but carefully, following the facility map he'd memorized. Crane's research lab was on the 3rd sublevel, deep in the heart of the complex where the most sensitive work took place. As he descended the stairwell, memories of the night his family died flickered through his mind like flames. The faulty sprinkler system that had malfunctioned when they needed it most, the gas leak that should have been contained by Meridian's safety protocols, the way the emergency systems had failed in perfect, deadly sequence. It hadn't been an accident. It had been a cover-up. 2 floors down, he whispered into his radio. "Still clear on the cameras," Sarah responded. "But Marcus, there's something else. I've been monitoring emergency frequencies, and there are reports of system failures at 3 other locations tonight. All buildings equipped with Meridian systems." Marcus paused on the landing, ice forming in his stomach. "How many people?" "Unknown. But one's a hospital, Marcus. Pediatric ward." The urgency drove him faster down the final flight of stairs. Whatever Meridian was doing, it was escalating. The pattern Dr. Crane had discovered in her research, the systematic failures that looked random but followed a deliberate sequence, it was happening in real time. Sub-level 3 stretched before him, a maze of laboratories and testing chambers. He found Crane's lab halfway down the main corridor, her nameplate still mounted beside the door. The same keycard granted him access to a workspace frozen in time. Computer terminals hummed quietly in the darkness. Research files were scattered across workbenches, covered in 3 months of dust. But Marcus knew what he was looking for: Crane's hidden backup drives, the ones she'd mentioned in her encrypted communications with the EPA whistleblower who'd contacted him through the Forest Service. He found the first drive taped beneath her desk drawer, exactly where her coded message had indicated. The second was hidden inside a hollowed-out chemistry textbook on her shelf. But as he reached for the third location, a concealed panel behind her filing cabinet, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Marcus killed the small flashlight he'd been using and pressed himself against the wall beside the door. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by voices. "Told you Crane was getting too close," someone was saying. "Should have handled her sooner." The car accident worked, made it look natural. This voice Marcus recognized with a chill, Thomas Meridian himself, the company's CEO. But now we have this ex-fire chief sniffing around. He's been to the cabin, accessed Crane's research. The footsteps stopped directly outside the lab door. "Want me to handle it the same way?" the first voice asked. "Not yet. We need to know what he's found, who he's talked to. The system failures tonight will be blamed on cyber attacks, foreign interference. By morning, every news outlet will be running stories about vulnerable infrastructure, and Congress will fast-track our new defense contracts." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Meridian wasn't just covering up defective products. They were actively causing failures to drive demand for their newer, supposedly more secure systems. The hospital, the other buildings tonight, deliberate casualties in a corporate war game. "Motion sensors show someone accessed this lab 15 minutes ago," the first voice continued. "Could still be inside." The door handle turned. Marcus had seconds to act. He spotted an emergency exit at the far end of the lab and moved silently toward it, clutching the 2 data drives he'd recovered. Behind him, light spilled into the room as the door opened. "Search everything," Meridian ordered, "and put out an alert for Marcus Chen. I want him found tonight." Marcus slipped through the emergency exit just as footsteps entered the lab behind him. The stairwell beyond was pitch black, leading deeper into the facility's underground levels. His radio crackled softly. "Marcus, where are you?" "Security teams are mobilizing." He was trapped in the belly of the beast, carrying evidence that could save thousands of lives, if he could survive long enough to expose it. The warehouse loomed against the dawn sky like a sleeping giant, its windows reflecting the pale morning light. Marcus gripped the steering wheel of his pickup truck, watching as the first emergency vehicles arrived on scene. His heart hammered against his ribs as he recognized the familiar dance of preparation. Firefighters checking equipment, paramedics staging their ambulances, police cordoning off the area. But this time, he wasn't running toward the flames. This time, he was running toward something far more dangerous. Through his windshield, Marcus could see movement inside the warehouse, shadows shifting behind the glass. Decker was in there, along with God knew how many others. The accelerant would already be in place, strategically positioned to create maximum devastation. The same pattern Marcus had discovered in the cabin's hidden files, the pattern that had claimed his family. His radio crackled to life. "All units, we have confirmation of hostiles inside the structure. SWAT is en route, ETA 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Marcus closed his eyes and saw Elena's face, heard Tommy's laughter. The warehouse would be an inferno long before SWAT arrived. Decker had planned this perfectly, just as he'd planned all the others. Marcus opened his truck door and stepped into the crisp morning air. His hands found the familiar weight of the radio clipped to his belt, the one frequency Decker didn't know about, the emergency channel Marcus had discovered in the cabin's communications equipment. "Phoenix to all stations." Marcus spoke quietly into the radio. "I'm going in." Static answered him, then a voice he recognized, Captain Rodriguez from Station 19. "Marcus? Jesus, where are you?" "The Meridian Street warehouse. Decker's inside with hostages. He's going to torch the place, but there's something else. The building's foundation. It sits directly above the main gas distribution hub for the entire downtown district." The silence that followed was deafening. "Marcus," Rodriguez's voice was strained, "if that hub goes up, 16 city blocks, maybe more." Marcus was already walking toward the building's rear entrance, the one he'd spotted in the architectural plans he'd studied at the cabin. "I know how he works now. The fires, the timing, it's all connected to something bigger." As Marcus approached the warehouse, his mind raced through everything he'd learned in those isolated weeks. The patterns in Decker's attacks, the carefully chosen targets, the systematic destruction that always seemed to hit hardest when people least expected it. But there was something else, something personal that drove Decker's obsession with fire. The rear door was unlocked. Marcus slipped inside, immediately hit by the acrid smell of gasoline and something else, propane. The warehouse stretched before him like a cavern, filled with shadows and the soft murmur of voices from somewhere deep within the structure. Moving carefully between stacked crates and abandoned machinery, Marcus worked his way toward the voices. His years of experience in burning buildings served him well here. He knew how to move silently, how to read the flow of air and the way sound carried through large spaces. The voices grew clearer as he approached what appeared to be an office area built into the warehouse's center. Through a grimy window, Marcus could see them, 6 people bound and seated against the far wall, their faces pale with terror, and standing before them, his back to Marcus, was the man he'd been hunting. Decker was smaller than Marcus had imagined, his movements precise and deliberate as he adjusted something on a device in his hands. Even from this distance, Marcus could see the red digital display counting down. 47 minutes. Marcus keyed his radio, whispering into it. "I have visual on 6 hostages. Countdown timer showing 47 minutes. Decker has some kind of remote device. Marcus, get out of there. SWAT will handle it." No time. Marcus was already moving, circling around the office to find another way in. "He's not planning to negotiate. This isn't about the hostages. They're just bait. He wanted me here." The realization hit him like a physical blow. All of it, the cabin, the files, even the anonymous tip that had brought the authorities here. It was all designed to draw Marcus into this moment. Decker had been planning this confrontation since the night Marcus's family died. Marcus found a service door that led directly into the office area. His hand rested on the handle as he spoke one last time into his radio. "Tell my wife I'm sorry I couldn't save her, but maybe I can save them." He turned off the radio and pushed open the door. Decker turned slowly, as if he'd been expecting this exact moment. His face was unremarkable, the kind of face that would disappear in a crowd. But his eyes held a madness that Marcus recognized, the same desperate fury he'd seen in his own mirror during those dark months after the fire. "Hello, Marcus," Decker said softly. "I've been waiting for you." The morning sun filtered through the smoke-stained windows of the Forest Service station as Marcus stood before a room full of fire chiefs, emergency coordinators, and government officials. His hands trembled slightly as he held the weathered journal that had changed everything. The detailed documentation of wind patterns, fire behavior, and early warning systems that old Henrik Larsson had spent decades perfecting in his remote cabin. "The traditional approach waits for fires to start, then responds," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But Larsson's system predicts fire behavior up to 72 hours in advance, allowing for preemptive evacuations and strategic resource deployment." Deputy Chief Sarah Chen leaned forward from the front row. She'd been the one to answer his call 3 weeks ago when he'd stumbled from the forest, clutching Henrik's journals and babbling about revolutionary fire prediction methods. Most would have dismissed him as a broken man seeing phantoms, but Sarah had listened. She'd seen the calculations, the meticulous observations, the breakthrough that could save thousands of lives. "The pilot program results speak for themselves," Sarah announced, standing to address the room. "In the past 2 weeks, we've successfully predicted and prevented 3 major fires using Larson's methodology. 0 casualties, minimal property damage. This isn't just innovation, it's transformation." Marcus watched the faces in the room shift from skepticism to interest to genuine excitement. He thought of Henrik, alone in that cabin for 30 years, documenting patterns that no one had believed possible to predict. The old man had lost his own family to fire, just as Marcus had, but instead of retreating into despair, he'd channeled his grief into purpose. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that his own family's death had led him to that cabin, to Henrik's legacy, to this moment. Emma, Daniel, and little Sophie were gone. Nothing would change that bitter truth. But their deaths had set in motion a chain of events that would prevent other families from suffering the same fate. "Chief Torres," came a voice from the back. Marcus recognized him as Director Walsh from the State Emergency Management Office. "What kind of implementation timeline are we looking at?" Marcus consulted his notes, still amazed that he was standing here as an expert rather than an exile. "Phase 1 deployment can begin immediately in high-risk zones. We'll need teams trained in Larson's observation techniques, upgraded monitoring equipment, and integration with existing emergency response protocols. Full statewide implementation within 18 months. The questions came rapidly after that. Technical details about wind measurement, humidity calculations, fuel moisture content assessments. Marcus answered each one, drawing on months of studying Henrik's work and weeks of field testing. The broken man who'd fled to the woods 6 months ago felt like a stranger now. As the meeting concluded and officials filed out with folders full of implementation plans, Sarah approached him. "You know they're going to want you to head the new division," she said quietly. Marcus nodded. He'd expected as much. The irony was complete. The fire chief, who'd been stripped of his position for failing to save his own family, was now being offered a chance to save countless others. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that responsibility again." "Maybe that's exactly why you're the right person for it," Sarah replied. "You understand the cost of failure better than anyone." Through the window, Marcus could see smoke rising in the distance, not from a fire, but from a controlled burn, carefully managed using Henrik's predictive models. The smoke that had once represented his nightmares now symbolized hope, prevention, lives saved before danger could touch them. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister, saw the news coverage. Mom and Dad would be proud. Emma, Daniel, and Sophie, too. Marcus stepped outside as the last officials departed. The forest stretched endlessly before him, no longer a place of exile but a reminder of purpose found in the darkest moments. Henrik's cabin stood empty again, but his life's work lived on, spreading across the state like seeds carried on favorable winds. The weight of grief would never fully lift. Marcus knew that now, but it could be transformed, channeled into something larger than personal loss. Every family that would sleep safely because of early warnings, every home that would stand because of preemptive evacuations, every life saved by Henrik's revolutionary system, they were all connected to the 3 lives he hadn't been able to save. As Marcus drove away from the station, heading toward his new role as Director of Predictive Fire Management, he carried with him the weathered journal and the hard-won knowledge that redemption didn't erase the past, it gave meaning to it. The fire that had taken everything from him had ultimately led him to save thousands of others. In the rearview mirror, the forest gradually disappeared, but its lessons remained. Sometimes salvation came not from preventing tragedy, but from transforming it into purpose.